Hello, I'm John Haynes. I'm the professor for this class, and this is a class on the theology and philosophy of worship. These lectures are primarily intended to be supplementary material and overview material for the interns taking this class for credit, as well as students in the seminary class. But it's also available for all of you who are taking this class free of charge or are wanting to, as laymen in your churches, develop a theology and philosophy of worship. So welcome to you all. To begin with this first lecture, we're going to be talking about and thinking about a definition of worship. I would like for you to put this video on pause and write down your definition of worship. Now, maybe you haven't thought much about a definition of worship, but that's okay. Just write down what comes first to your mind, or maybe you have a well thought out definition. Either way, write it down and then send that to me and then come back to this lecture. All right, you're back to this lecture and you've written down your theology, or your definition of worship in to whatever level that you had that thought out. There's a lot of different definitions of worship out there, and I certainly am not coming to this lecture claiming that I have a corner of the truth. I do not. I'm constantly developing what I think is a good definition of worship. And the first thing we want to ask is, why do you need a definition of worship? Well, not everybody does, but we are practitioners. You're watching this video most likely because you're either a worship director, or you're a priest, or you're a pastor. You're a worship leader in some kind of way, and we're practitioners. We have got to train our people in ways that are easy for them to understand what worship is, so that they can grow and they can mature. When you look at your definition of worship, and when you read other definitions that are part of your required reading for this particular week, this assignment, you're going to see in Don Hustad's book and in John Frame's book in particular, different definitions of worship. And they're all very, very helpful. And any book on worship that you read is going to define worship. Over the years, though, I've found that a lot of those definitions of worship are either incomplete, or they're very academic and they're not really describing the experience of what the common Joe and Jane just have in the pew. So they'll read those definitions of worship and sometimes be a little confused, or it doesn't mean anything to them. Or once you start explaining worship to them, they're like, yeah, that's something that I already experience in my heart. And so that's what I want to talk about. Sometimes the definitions of worship are a little heady. For instance, you're going to see John Frame's very well thought out and very succinct definition of worship in your required reading from chapter 1 in Worshiping in Spirit and Truth. So open that book and read his definition of worship. Now open up Don Hustad's book to the section on worship, and you're going to see a number of different definitions of worship. And I want you to compare all of those. Take a look and then come back to this lecture. You've read those definitions now, and you're thinking about them and comparing them. And I would like to ask you some questions. Is there anything in those definitions that seem incomplete to you? I look at these definitions, and sometimes I think not only these, but anybody else's definition, and I go, okay, what are we really asking here? Are we really asking what is the definition of worship, that is, the very word itself? And so do we really need to go back and look at the morphology of the word and divide it and look at the history and its context and all that kind of thing? Does that really help us? Well, that's an academic exercise, and I think that can be very helpful. But language is always changing, and I don't find it of much practical use to divide the word worship and know its historic context and come back and then have a meaningful definition that means a whole lot to me right now outside of a fairly distant definition. At the same time, I don't find very helpful definitions of worship that aren't clear, concise, and cogent, and are just expressed words and expressed feelings on what a person's more existential relationship is with the word in their own experience. And so we've got to come up with a definition, and I'm not going to really give you one in this class. I'm going to make you think and come up with a definition that is practical, helpful to the average congregant, but is also one that is going to grow. So let's begin with this. What are we asking in the definition of worship? We really aren't asking, what does the word worship mean? We are asking, what is true Christian worship? There's an exclusivity there. And when you look at a definition, I ask, does that word reflect the exclusivity of what we are experiencing in Christian worship? So look at those definitions. And I would say that a number of them can be transferred to any other religion. For instance, there are going to be definitions of worship that say, divides the word up, and it will say something like, worship is the glorification of our transcendent and holy covenant God. Okay, I mean that's interesting, that's academic, but what does that mean? And if you take the word covenant out of it, you can transplant that word, that definition, to any other religion, quite frankly. Even putting the word covenant in it. The word covenant in our Christian context means something, but really to other people, they've got covenants and that kind of thing. I'm not trying to be facetious. I am trying to push us, though, to a real meaning of the word worship. What is true worship? And here's what I'm going to ask that you consider. If you look at the word worship, let's think about other words, other relational words. For instance, let's look at the word friend or soulmate. Now, if I were just to take those two words and tell you the linguistic history of those words and all that kind of thing, well then that would be helpful, but that's not going to spark inside anyone else the feeling of, yeah, that's what that is. That's what that is in my experience. And so I'm saying, what is our definition of worship going to do that sparks in another Christian? Yeah, that's what that is. That's my experience. And I think to come up with that definition, we're going to first go to the scriptures. And not that our other authors have not, and I'm going to tell you, they have far greater minds than me. But I'm a practitioner.